Hello, it's me, Fatso, the clean boy who likes clean things. I make a lot of videos, 52 a year to be precise. That's not including videos of scan cats, more than newly formed notice future cleaning zone, not counting streams or bonus videos or whatever. If I met my full obligation of videos this forthcoming year, I would produce 469 videos when I'm always talking and shooting off my big mouth. You can imagine that sometimes this makes some people wonderfully, impotently angry. I made a video like 3 years ago about handcaps, and to this day, I get new response videos that incoherently try to dispute it without addressing any of the points I made. I've had many handcap scoffers because of that video, which I don't understand because as my video is more popular than any of the videos that responded to it, by their logic and the laws of the market, it is therefore the superior video. They should be thanking me. Typically, I don't respond to these responses because the guy's point was, come on, I say the things I think, and I'm happy to give others the last word. I'm not going to get sucked into some back and forth with some weirdo online. I'm not going to give them my attention. They can say whatever they want about me. They can think they want. That's fine. It's not like anything they're saying is interesting enough to respond to. But then, last week, I made a video where they made fun of Caleb Mountain and Jody Brower as the latter said all sorts of wild transphobic shit, and then the former nodded along warmlessly. Now, I'll be honest, I hadn't heard of either of these dinguses until I saw a clip from this interview tweeted by the Serbs. I thought they made a compelling case for the argument I wanted to make about how class reductionism divides the working class. And the more I looked into it, the more perfect of an example it became, because it turns out Caleb is always palling around with Alexander Dugan, the Nosball guy, the guy who made Nosballs. More on that later. And so what better example of class reductionism can we find than a fascist sympathizing shitlord using the pretense of class to justify bigotry against a marginalized group predominantly composed of working class people? And I thought, he'll probably have something to say about this, but I did not expect the form his response would take, and it has delighted me beyond my wildest expectations. Like Pat Antonata and the Serbs before me, thanks to their responses in the description, I had to go over this video because it's quite frankly too funny to ignore.
Hey folks, so it's recently come to my attention that a certain internet pseudo-leftist personality who calls himself Thought Smart has decided to target Jyoti Brar, the prominent communist leader, and myself. The reason he's decided to go after us is because he disapproves of something that Jyoti Brar said in an interview I did with her 9 months ago.
Ah, yes. I targeted them with my insidious disagreement with their point of view. I put a target on his back by disagreeing with the words that someone else said.
Now, this is not the first time someone has tried to paint me as a bigot who advocates further oppression of the transgender community. However, I've always given a pretty clear answer when directly asked about the issue. Take a listen to what happened when Bosch tried to gotcha me and paint me as a transphobe in our recent debate about tankies and their role in the left.
How do you feel about transgender people?
I think the way that they're treated is awful. Bullying, hate crimes, it's despicable. The way people, have been separated from their families, kicked out of their households. I feel nothing but empathy for people that are transgender and face all the hate and discrimination on that basis.
You agree that gender reassignment surgery is a valid way of addressing their, gender dysphoria?
If an adult chooses to do that, that's their business. It has nothing to do with me. Hate crime, discrimination, bullying is something that any progressive would oppose. I'm with you on that.
What about China?
Nice try, Bosch. Sneakily trying to get him with a gotcha like that. This is the oldest trick in the book. Here's how this works. Is this is how you get people. You ask a question, right? Then what you do is you listen patiently as they respond and kind of just nod and indicate that the answer is better than they expected. And then, right, that's when the trap is sprung and you just move on to another subject. You got to wake up pretty early in the morning to trick Caleb with that kind of good faith discussion.
The thing is, I've always understood the transgender issue to be an issue of human rights. Transgender people are victims of hate crimes very frequently by bigots who somehow feel threatened by their very existence. Transgender people have difficulty finding jobs because of discrimination in employment. Transgender people often face being kicked out of their household of their families reject them and upset them. And not only have I always taken this position, but I've been quite active around it. Before I was a journalist, when I was an activist, on many occasions I took to the streets of New York City to march for trans rights. Now, you'll notice that the clip which this thought line individual objected to was not about whether transgender people should be beaten up and killed. It wasn't about whether they should face discrimination in hiring. It wasn't about whether their families should reject them. It wasn't about any of that. It was about transgender ideology. And honestly, I do not know enough about this topic. I am not well informed enough about the issue of transgender ideology to make a comment on it.
Hey, Caleb, I don't recall calling you a transphobe in my video. I did take issue with the transphobic argument someone else made in the video you published. I never meant to insinuate you were a transphobe. I just think you're sympathetic to the arguments transphobes make because you sat and listened and offered no resistance, and also you're probably a transphobe, but too cowardly to admit it. What do you think is the justification of those human rights abuses? Where do you think that comes from? Why is it, do you think, Caleb, that people discriminate against trans people? Since by your own admission, you're not educated on the subject, let me explain it to you. It comes from the unscientific insistence that people are somehow not the gender they identify with.
Our view is, and it's not about moving against a trans person. It's the ideology that's being pushed on people that says, you are what you think you are.
This is the root cause of the human rights abuses you care so deeply about. Trans people are excluded from gendered bathrooms on this basis. The Trump administration is keeping them out of homeless shelters on this basis, despite the fact that the trans community is disproportionately homeless because people kick them out of their homes on this basis. Transpanic murders are committed on this basis, and some of the murderers are acquitted on this basis. It's good that you're willing to stand up and fight for trans rights, but if your allyship does not extend to considering trans men to be men, trans women to be women, and non-binary people being valid, then you're just going to back for the root cause of the oppression you're fighting the symptoms of. People are who they say they are. People understand the reality of their own relationship with gender better than others do. To refer to this as simply transgender ideology insinuates that trans people are indoctrinating people, but they're deliberately confusing the issue to suit some sinister agenda. That is, in fact, the claim that Jody Braun made that I took issue with. The claim that you made no effort to dispute or even question.
The likes of Mr. Thoughtsline try to portray it as if you must be a supporter of imperialism if you are to advocate against the oppression of transgender people. And furthermore, all who defend anti-imperialist and existing socialist states are somehow advocates of harming transgender people.
Yeah, man, that's definitely what I think, Caleb. I love imperialism, big fan of imperialism around here. But hypothetically, wouldn't it be embarrassing for you if in the very video you're responding to, I expressly said you had to fight imperialism in order to stand for trans rights? And I think that would look a little something like this. Capitalism is built on white supremacy, it's built on patriarchy, it's built on cis heteronormativity, on ableism, on settler colonialism, on imperialism. It's an interlocking and mutually reinforcing system. We don't get to pick and choose. You either fight the whole thing or you're fighting none of it. You're giving quarter to it. Fucking got him. I fucking got him, everybody.
Who was the first prominent transgender activist in U.S. history? It was Leslie Feinberg. Leslie Feinberg was a leader of the Workers' World Party, and Leslie Feinberg was a tanky. She was a defender of Cuba, a defender of North Korea, a defender of the Soviet Union and China. She spoke in defense of the Islamic Republic of Iran. She spoke in defense of many governments around the world, and she viewed the transgender struggle as a struggle that was involved with tearing down U.S. imperialism.
So, couple things. Boy, Caleb, once again, it'd just be so embarrassing for you if I said that exact thing in my video, the one that you were right now responding to. Leslie Feinberg was by no means the first American prominent transgender activist. The term transgender is relatively modern. She may well have been the first activist to self-identify using that term, I don't know. But there were many trans activists in the United States before her, including at Stonewall, where the modern LGBTQ rights movement was born. That being said, Leslie absolutely deserves recognition for her work, which I would never try to take away from her. I never said, and wouldn't say, that all Marxists or all Marxist-Leninists are transphobes, because I don't believe that. I do believe Jody Farrar is, not because she's a Marxist-Leninist, but rather because of all of the transphobic shit she said out loud using her mouth. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist myself, and I tend to actually disagree with a lot of Marxist-Leninist positions. But I'd be willing to bet that the overwhelming majority of Marxist-Leninists would be likewise disgusted by Ms. Farrar's comments, which I don't think reflect the popular ML position.
Now, I don't know whether what Josie Farrar said about the ideology being promoted by many transgender activists today is correct or not. I simply don't have the knowledge. I've heard people from both sides of the issue talk, and they both say things that are very persuasive. I just don't know enough about it. However, even if Josie Farrar were to be dead wrong about this issue, even if everything she said is completely wrong, that would not take away from the fact that Josie Farrar is an amazing, heroic, anti-imperialist activist.
Seems like you kind of do know, though. Seems like you do agree with her. Otherwise, you wouldn't be so mad that I responded to it, and that would make your unwillingness to admit that and kind of throw her under the bus in this matter. Kind of having a good opinion or doing good work in one area does not absolve you of your other shitty opinions. You get that, right? Like, I never said Jody Farrar is human scum, incapable of ever thinking anything good or doing anything worthwhile ever. I said she got the trans issue wrong because of how she said the words out loud that were wrong. In fact, my whole point was about class reductionism, how various vectors of oppression get collapsed and ignored to focus on a myopic view of class. And now you're arguing that she can't have a bad take about this vector of oppression because she has such good class takes. That's too perfect for words. You prove on my point,
Is it possible that great revolutionary activists, great, important, amazing work to oppose capitalism and imperialism can also make mistakes? Yes, it is, but not according to Mr. Gottslot. If you say one thing that he disagrees with, not about human rights, but rather about ideology, you're an asshole, that's what he refers to me as, and not only are you wrong, but you deserve to be beaten out. That's basically what he's arguing here. You would have myself, someone who has been very outspoken and opposing all forms of oppression. You would have Josie Farrar, a prominent leader of communist activists and a woman of color in the United Kingdom, attacked as Red Browns and Nazguls.
Oh, no. That's complete misrepresentation. That's not why I called you the Nazgul. It's because you're always palling around with Dugan, the Nazgul guy.
I saw Harold Trump speak, and there were many times that he spoke right for it. I heard him talk about how there's this elite that's not loyal to the United States, and international background.
I called Jody Farrar no such thing. I have no evidence that she's a Nazgul, aside from her agreeing to do an interview with you, which doesn't reflect well on her in that matter. Let me back up here if you're not familiar with Nazgul. Let me show you the Nazgul flag. Hey, does that set off any alarm bells in your mind? That make you think of anything? How about this one? That look familiar? Does that make you think of anything? Does that make you think of any group in history? Nazguls are Nazis with a Soviet aesthetic. I could go into detail about the bizarre philosophy that undergirds this, but it's nonsense made up to justify speaking fascist into leftist space. It bills itself as a synthesis of fascism and socialism, which means that it's just fascism that they say bourgeois and proletariat more. Here's Caleb giving a speech about how the West is a culture of weakness.
Anything that is perceived as weakness or disempowering, that's worship. And anything that is conceived of as strength, or showing pride in oneself, or building up one's strength, that's attack. And that's said, well, that's fascism.
That junky little freak right next to him was nodding along. Why, it's Alexander Dugin, because they're at a Nazgul conference. So that's why I called you that, Caleb, because you are that thing, very demonstrably. But for full context, let's play the clip where I called for violence against them and discuss whether or not it went too far. Okay, my producer is giving me word that I didn't actually say that. Now I need you to fasten your seatbelts, folks, for the next clip because things are about to go off the friggin' rails pretty hard.
This understanding that I have that sometimes people can't take very good progressive views on some issues while being problematic and very wrong on others doesn't simply apply to communists. I have been widely attacked because I will defend and uphold the role played by Black Minister Louis Farrakhan. Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam is not a communist, and there are things to be said about Jewish people and about the LGBT community that I vehemently disagree with.
You know, that you just got mad that I called you an asshole, and then to defend yourself, you stand a vicious anti-Semite. If you wanted to make the point that otherwise worthwhile figures could have bad social views or be incidentally bigoted in some way that doesn't really reflect the totality of their work, even if you wanted to specifically go with anti-Semitism as your example, you could have picked Karl Marx, dude. Karl Marx made a few anti-Semitic remarks, but I think most people would agree he's still a pretty worthwhile leftist statement. Farrakhan hasn't made a few anti-Semitic remarks. He's a Holocaust denier, and he says that satanic Jews control the world and the government. He puts Jews at the center of Black oppression. You can't divorce his views from his anti-Semitism. You do not, under any circumstances, gotta hand it to him. But of course, Caleb thinks Farrakhan is great because, unlike CIA-funded Trotskyists, he supported Gaddafi.
In 2011, when NATO bombs were falling, we literally faced a bombing and an onslaught at the hands of imperialism. These Trotskyites were cheering for that intervention. Why? Oh, Gaddafi's a dictator. Gaddafi's a Stalinist. Gaddafi's an imperialist. But here is what Minister Louis Farrakhan, not a communist, said.
Does he share the wealth of Libya with the poor? Now, Gaddafi is a complicated situation. A lot of good things for the people. Gaddafi is healthcare and education. On the other hand, and content warning, there will be some discussion of sexual assault from your friends coming up. So skip the time code here to avoid that. He also had a dungeon where he took abducted citizens to rape and torture them. There are pictures of it, something like Caleb will attempt to pretend that's just the CIA rumor. He also had gay people publicly flogged, a crushed dissent of any kind with public executions. And if I were to pick a world leader for whom support was non-negotiable as a socialist, I probably wouldn't go with the guy who was worth $200 billion US at the time of his death. We're only a third of the way through, folks. Just let that sink in, because it gets weirder. Watch.
This is him explaining how he seems to understand the class struggle.
The fact that a small handful of rich wolves owns most of the money and will all die of starvation and exposure if we don't get some of it, even though we're producing more than we need and throwing away almost half of everything at a time when that overproduction is poised to make our planet uninhabitable, just so that the already unfathomably rich ghouls can have a computer readout that says that their wealth increased by 0.0001%, and the only way that you can get the means of your survival is by throwing yourself into perpetual and worsening exploitation forever? Need to worry about making a living and surviving the forthcoming end of the world. Well, the aforementioned handful of rich fools, no.
So according to Mr. Thoughtslime, the problem with capitalism isn't that in the pursuit of profits, capitalists are organizing the economy irrationally, and that even though levels of productivity are rising, people are getting further and further into poverty. The problem with capitalism is that there's just too many resources being used. There's
Caleb, my sweet summer child, this is such a willful misreading of what I said.
There's too many people in the world. We all have too much stuff. We're overproducing. That's called Malthusianism. And Malthusianism is an idea that Karl Marx thoroughly refuted. Mr. Thoughtslime should read Theories of Surplus Value and read how Karl Marx completely refuted this ideology that there are limited resources in the world and that we're headed towards some kind of apocalypse unless we can drastically reduce the human population and get rid of useless eaters.
Yeah, I in fact don't think that the world is overpopulated. I don't think the issue is that people are using too many resources. I very consciously chose the word overproduction, not overconsumption. And that's an indisputable facet of how modern neoliberal industry is fucking over everyone. Things like huge stockpiles of food being thrown away rather than feeding the hungry, fast fashion, manufactured obsolescence, single-use plastics. These are just facts of modern capitalist production, Caleb. My point was never that the world is overpopulated or that we have to get rid of useless eaters. I mentioned overproduction and ranked about how the economy is organized to suit bourgeois interests. The overproduction I'm talking about doesn't feed people. It, in fact, detracts from our ability to feed people. That's the problem. He's putting words in my mouth here because he can't actually refute the substance of anything I've said. He has to take me out of context while also showing his audience my words in context. Just word to the wise, my dude. You were editing this. If you wanted to make up lies about me, you could just cut out the parts where I demonstrate those lies aren't true. It's simply amazing.
Watching this video about Mr. Thought's line is belief and his motivation. Take a look at this part.
Me and a black man might be equally exploited working at a Burger King together. Say you're working at Burger King. Your coworker comes to you because they know you're a big-time lefto, big-time workers' rights kind of person, and they're like, hey, I think I might be trans, and I want to start to transition, but I'm really afraid that if I do, I'll lose my job.
Burger King. Now, I really doubt that Mr. Thought's line has ever worked in fast food.
Well, you got me there, Caleb. I've never worked fast food. But hypothetically, Caleb, wouldn't it be embarrassing for you if I worked fast food and several other shitty minimum wage jobs, and the video right before the video you were responding to was about that? And if within the first few seconds of that video, I mentioned working in fast food specifically for several years? I've had many shitty jobs throughout the years, and sometimes I like to make videos about them, and this is one of those videos. If you've been following this small series, you'll remember that I worked for a Canadian coffee chain called Tim Hortons. I also worked at a Pizza Hut in a gas station that later was no longer a Pizza Hut in a gas station.
However, I did work in fast food when I was a college student. One summer, during my college years, I actually worked at a sandwich shop. It was fast food in the area near the college I went to.
Now, Caleb, don't you think it'd just be humiliating for you if rather than touring working class life for one summer in college, I in fact worked in such jobs for over a decade to survive? Wouldn't that embarrass you? Wouldn't that make you look like a real asshole? Caleb intuits that I never worked in fast food for me saying the word burger in a funny way. That's his evidence. From that, he can draw a conclusion.
Burger King.
He is a professional journalist, everyone. The thing is, it's a joke. I like to put jokes in my video so that they're fun to watch instead of just renting into a webcam for half an hour, getting madder and madder at a version of my opponent I made up. Say you're working at Burger King. Your coworker comes to you because they know you're a big-time lefto, big-time workers' rights kind of person, and they're like, hey, I think I might be trans, and I want to start to transition, but I'm really afraid that if I do, I'll lose my job.
And I'll tell you one thing. The last thing that I ever did when I was working, assembling hamburgers and running a fryer at a fast food place was to talk to my coworkers about their gender identity. We weren't sitting there and having group therapy and talking about discrimination or how we felt about our gender identities. We were being driven to work harder and harder and harder.
See, you did learn to edit me out of context. You're getting there, buddy. The example I was giving there was of a situation where someone might build solidarity in the workplace. And your sneering condescension to workers would not do that. When I worked at those kind of jobs, we often had deep conversations. But we weren't allowed to, we weren't supposed to. But when you're a vaguely sociable human being, other people just kind of open up to you if you spend hours a day with them. About their home lives, their love life, their sexuality, all this kind of came up. Maybe I would discuss those things with you because you seem like a real asshole who wouldn't listen or treat them with respect if they did. Which is why, in the example I gave, that you very cleverly edited to disguise that fact, I said that the solution to the problem was to build solidarity. Behold, the viewing globe. Say you're working at Burger King. Your coworker comes to you because they know you're a big-time lefto, big-time workers' rights kind of person, and they're like, hey, I think I might be trans, and I want to start to transition, but I'm really afraid that if I do, I'll lose my job. Which of the following responses is more likely to get that person involved in the struggle against capitalism? A, I'll support you however I can. As workers, we have to stick together because our bosses will seek to divide us. I'll do whatever it takes to protect your rights. How can I help? Or B, no, you're delusional. You're oppressed in this job and that's the one thing that matters.
According to this pseudo-leftist milieu, if you talk about working people, if you talk about class struggle, if you rant against the billionaires and bankers and monopolists that rule the world, you're a fascist. According to them, working class is a fascist buzzword. According to them, working families is somehow a discriminatory phrase.
Yep, yeah, you got me again, Caleb. But hypothetically, wouldn't it be embarrassing for you? Liberals will use the term class reductionism to just mean like someone who talks about class, and that's bullshit, and that's not what it is. When I use the term class reductionism, I'm not necessarily calling anyone a bigot. I'm not saying you're a bad person or a bad leftist necessarily. I think it's a thing that anyone can just do sometimes, myself included.
For them, socialism is about the individuality of artists and middle-class intellectuals, and them standing up against the mob of inferior rabble. Don't go to NYU to learn about these abstract gender theories that you must immediately agree with, or else you're the equivalent of cattle.
Caleb, I went to Memorial University of Newfoundland because the tuition was the cheapest there, and it was all I could afford at the time. I didn't study abstract gender theory, but I did live in constant fear that people would discover my secret longing to express a different gender from the one I was assigned at birth. Because this isn't actually an abstract issue for me. It is for you, and not you. So, there's that. Okay, get ready, everyone, because if you gave me a million years, I'd never think of an ending this difficult. Just observe.
I think the best way to understand the difference between this individual and myself is simply to look at the name himself on slide and the image in the background of this video. Mr. Bot Slime has this image of slime, green, gross slime, pouring out of the sewer behind him the whole time he is speaking. Working people are trying to get rid of slime. They're trying to get rid of dirt. They don't like the fact that construction in the United States is apart, that our roads and bridges are in decay, that water is being contaminated with lead, with opioids, and drugs are taking the lives of working people in big numbers, that there's hopelessness and despair among working people, so much poverty is taking place. They don't like that. Working people want to get to a better life. That is the difference. Folks, there's a reason. The CIA, at the same time, was covertly funding Trotskyites and anti-communist leftists with its Congress for Cultural Freedom program. Also covertly funded the work of Jackson Pollock and tried to marginalize the school of art known as social realism. So many countries have broken free from capitalism. When they've done it, they haven't tried to make their countries more slimy and gross. They haven't put up paintings of abstract art from Jackson Pollock. Instead, they have built some of the most beautiful cities, the most beautiful subway system, beautiful gardens we've ever seen. Working people are trying to get out of the slime.
First of all, I take great umbrage with you saying that the slime behind me is disgusting. It's not. People often say that they want to eat the slime. I don't blame them. It looks like Pecto Cooler. It looks delicious. How dare you? You know what? Fine. If that's what it takes to get through to you, fine. I'll conform to the same bourgeois respectability standard that you think is working class for some reason. Mr. Caleb would have you believe that to argue with someone, you simply have to invent a position that they coded, and then argue with them. Well, I disagree. I think it's better to argue with positions that a person actually holds, which is why I always state my positions clearly. I believe that trans men are men, trans women are women, non-binary people are non-binary. I don't consider this to be an abstract ideological position, but rather the basis for the material oppression of trans and gender non-conforming. Mr. Malkin seems unwilling to state his position on the subject. I have a suspicion as to why that is. He believes that if he obscures the issue, makes it out to be some inscrutable ideological position that he couldn't possibly hope to untangle without some liberal college education, you'll let him off the hook. Surely, though, you do understand that you, Jim, are the gender you feel that you are. Surely, you understand how insulting and hurtful it would be if everyone else decided you were a woman and treated you as such. This isn't a highfalutin idea, it's about as simple as it gets. But even if I were to accept his excuse, that he's simply uneducated on the subject, and thus does not want to comment, why then did he platform Mr. Art's comments on the subject in the first place, knowing that many, as he said, would consider them to be hate speech?
You also talked about being accused of hate speech, and I've noticed increasingly there is a lot less tolerance for different views in left circles. Just everything you said here would be grounds to issue bans from various left-wing conventions or gatherings. And, someone could even, I've even heard people advocate violence against people who state such things. And
why would he not look into why that is? If this is a matter of simply being uneducated, why didn't he educate himself further before defending what Mr. Arch said? Defending her points while making clear that he has no position on the subject himself is, in my opinion, cowardly. And this points to the key ideological difference between someone like Mr. Caleb Malcolm and myself. I don't believe you can draw a neat little line between bigoted ideology and the material results of that ideology. I'm sure Mr. Malcolm will have all sorts of ridiculous claims and how he chooses to respond to this video. But if he is to be honest in this discussion, he must be pressed to answer one specific question. Are trans women women? Are trans men men? Are non-binary people men? Unless he can answer in the affirmative, he is upholding the bigoted and oppressive view that holds back trans workers, and can't meaningfully be said to be an advocate of the working class without putting in asterisks next to the term. Hello and welcome to the Eyeball Zone. Here in the Eyeball Zone, the eyeballs play. Here in the Eyeball Zone, the eyeballs play. And Lord Opulon casts a long shadow from grave to grave over small leftist content creators who need eyeballs on their work. Folks, enough fucking around this time. Let's go with the meat and potatoes discussion of gender from David J. Bradley, where he talks about how masculinity came to be in crisis, what that means, how it affects dudes and non-dudes alike, and how gendered expectations can feed directly into toxic masculinity. He goes into Judith Butler's performative gender theory, which I touched on in the previous video, but didn't really go into detail about, because I was rushing. Do you have a small leftist project you'd like to see featured here in the Eyeball Zone? Send me no more than one email to thoughtslimeeditor@gmail.com with pertinent information like your pronouns, and perhaps you will be trapped here. Well, thanks for watching another kooky old video of mine, everybody. What a character, this Caleb. I bet he was going to have something to say about this, but it's... What a dude. What a dude. If you like this video, press the like button or whatever. I don't even care, whatever. Subscribe also. Not that it's a big deal to me. Not that I like you or anything. Hello, some more news consumers. Some newbers. It's me, your news boss. Welcome to the marketplace of news. So, the former president and current wedding DJ, Donald Trump, has mostly been gone for a few months now. And I will admit that I underestimated the impact that would have on my mental, emotional, spiritual, and digestive health of having spectacular boobs, my friends. But unfortunately, my intestinal insecurity has been replaced by a far more existential dread. The throbbing headache of anxiety brought on by the fear that Joe Biden and the Democrats will once again squander an opportunity of having power over the executive and legislative branches of government, and essentially screw the pooch, as it were, a phrase which literally translates to having sex with a dog, which don't, by the way. But this provocative pooch, this magnetic mongrel, this horny hound that the Democrats are currently flirting with, is named austerity. Weird name for a dog. Austerity is essentially a set of economic policies that cut public sector spending with the stated goal of limiting the national debt. And so the question is, will the Democrats be seduced by the husky allure of this government stinginess toward the working class and poor that has defined the last 40-plus years of American politics? A socio-political worldview grounded in capital and in turn white supremacy,
and designed to benefit the rich and powerful? Or will they resist the seductive charm of this dog-eat-dog free market paradigm? Will I stop it with the dog stuff? Good news, yes. Bad news, we're talking about the federal budget today. Now, as we come up on the 6-month mark of Joe Biden's presidency, it's safe to say that his most significant legislative accomplishment thus far has been the American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. And even though the Democrats cut out the $15 minimum wage increase, botched both policy and political messaging around stimulus checks, and reduced the number of total Americans who would receive those checks for no other reason than a mix-up with the 2020 election ballots. See, Joe Manchin was on the ballot. We voted for him instead of Joe Biden. I'm sorry that this is how you found out. But it would be dishonest for me not to acknowledge that this legislation is arguably one of the most progressive spending bills in more than a generation, which, to be fair and balanced, T to the M to C to R, could also be seen as an indictment of the legislation passed over the last generation and the fact that it took a global pandemic to do this. Anyway, as the final negotiations for the infrastructure package go on, time will tell whether Democrats will continue to buck the trend of the scarcity dogma that has executed a stranglehold over our politics for decades. But in the meantime, the COVID relief bill is providing billions of dollars for local and state governments, schools, union pensions, the restaurant industry, the child care industry, healthcare, rental assistance, and include monthly payments for families with children that could cut child poverty in half. Why we couldn't just eliminate child poverty altogether, I don't know. But still, for all its omissions and shortcomings and self-inflicted political wounds, this bill is helping a lot of people who desperately need it. But also, those payments expire at the end of the year. But also, the proposed American Families Plan extends them for 4 years. But also, Joe Manchin. Anyway, also not a great sign that Biden suggests spending leftover COVID relief money on hiring more cops. Why, yes, sir, we will get the police right on that coronavirus problem. But the bill did cost nearly $2 trillion. That is quite a price tag if you think money is real. So, of course, in opposition to this bill, like clockwork, as predicted, the Republicans have been screaming from the rooftops about the budget deficit and national debt. Right?
Now, from the toy world, was a case of crosswires for a major corporate U-turn when news broke that the company Hasbro was losing the Mr. from Mr. Potato Head.
This is frankly where the left wants to go. I think this is the biggest threat to freedom these days.
But thanks to the New York Times and Dave Chappelle, Pepe Le Pew now has a bad reputation and therefore has to be cut out. There's no end in sight for all this. Nobody's perfect enough for the masses.
Oh, right. I almost forgot. Which is weird because we just did a video about this topic and this episode was written beforehand and we care. But everything from the right is about cancel culture now. Hey, Republicans, I just said the Democrats passed a $2 trillion spending bill. Something weird is going on. Again, the Democrats just passed the most progressive legislation in a generation, and the Republican counter-argument was Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head, and Pepe Le Pew. Deficit and debt hysteria have been the foundation of the Republican Party for decades, and now what? It's just cancel culture nonsense. I mean, you think I'm exaggerating? A Morning Consult Politico poll conducted in March found that Republicans had heard more about the Dr. Seuss issue than they had heard about the $1.9 trillion stimulus package. And since then, of course, they've moved on to complaining about the most basic idea for a Captain America story ever, and of course, critical race theory, which we will cover extensively in a future episode. Do we have a Listen, I know I may be a crisp young news dude in his 30s, but I'm old enough to remember the frenzied outrage over the national debt the Republicans unleashed during the Obama years. Obama was so afraid of these attacks from these deficit hawks and or bought into their worldview that he scaled down the stimulus bill following the Great Recession to ensure it wasn't too big, which ended up being a huge mistake that made the recovery from the Great Recession last much longer than it needed to. And even still, the Tea Party movement formed in opposition to this supposedly out-of-control government spending, allegedly, and dominated American politics for years. giving us gems like Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, who have haunted our nightmares ever since. Hiya! And then there was Paul Ryan, who actually carted out an enormous debt clock to illustrate how much of a crisis our national debt has become. Obama even validated their concerns over the debt and offered up cuts to Medicare and Social Security in exchange for tax increases on the rich to address the national debt in an effort to appease their relentless austerity onslaught from conservatives and/or he bought into their worldview. But the penny pinching proclivities of the Republicans were unsatisfied, and they literally shut down the government for 16 days over increasing the debt ceiling, putting our credit rating at risk with potentially catastrophic consequences, something that should concern a person who thinks money is real. This is how central and all-encompassing the issue of government spending and national debt was for the Republican Party during the Obama era. So, forgive me for being a little bit weirded out that after Joe Biden passes a nearly $2 trillion bill, all the Republicans can talk about is Mr. Potato Head's missing penis.
Mr. Potato Head now really has to go by Potato Heads. And the whole point of Mr. Potato Head is that you can move the parts around. He was America's first transgender doll, and even he got canceled.
I think it's worth taking a moment here to look more closely at the United States federal budget. Exciting, and we'll start by defining some terms. Even more exciting, the national debt refers to the overall amount of money our country has borrowed and therefore owes to its creditors, both domestic and international. The budget deficit refers to the annual shortfall created by the difference between how much money we take in and how much money we spend as a nation. Basically, how much further we go into debt each year. It would be helpful to use an analogy, so let's use your household budget as a comparison. In this example, your household income level would be the equivalent of tax revenue, and your credit card debt, student loans, etc., would be the equivalent of the national debt. So imagine a household where instead of paying the medical expenses to treat Clayton's rare blood disease, the family decided to squander over half of their discretionary spending on high-end surveillance and a 24/7 security detail of armed guards and multiple tanks parked out front to keep away potential burglars, as they simultaneously and frequently send their private mercenaries to break into their neighbors' homes and murder them and replace the parents with people more aligned with their interests. And then imagine one of the other kids in this family, Jalissa, lives in a mansion out back with a butler and a swimming pool, with more food than they could possibly eat and more money than they could ever possibly spend, while Bimothy starves in the cockroach and rat-infested basement. And in this analogy, predictably, Bimothy is disproportionately likely to be black. Did you forget we were talking about America? Did I forget what I was talking about? Oh, right. Your household finances are nothing like the multi-trillion-dollar budget of an entire nation that can issue bonds, raise taxes, or literally print more money anytime it wants to. Now, we don't need to talk about modern monetary theory or debate the impact of debt on interest rates or inflation or the potential risk of an overheating economy to have this discussion about austerity politics. Because, big reveal, this is not an economics class. You're free to go to college if you want to learn about something like that. I'm sorry, I say free and college in the same sentence. What I meant to say is, you are more than welcome to go into massive debt that you will never be able to get rid of, including through bankruptcy. Thanks, oh Biden, that will haunt you until the day you die. But more importantly, and I don't think I'm breaking some more news by saying this, the obvious truth is that when conservatives clutch their pearls over the national debt and budget deficit in the name of austerity, they are completely full of shit. They do not give a about the debt or the deficit. All you have to do is look at the deficit over the last 50 years to realize that it has increased under Republican administrations and decreased under Democratic administrations. Because if the GOP truly cared about the national debt, they wouldn't vote to increase it by more than $2 trillion via tax cuts for the rich. They wouldn't consistently increase our military budget, which is larger than the next 10 countries combined. And if they really cared about fiscal responsibility, they would recognize that this country spends over $1 trillion a year, 28% of our budget, on the consequences of child poverty. And so even if you couldn't care less about poor starving children, spending money on the front end to make sure we don't have a bunch of poor starving children we got to spend money on would save this country a lot of money. So no, they don't give a about the national debt. And it's not a coincidence that, as I mentioned before, poor starving children are disproportionately likely to be black. Now, the notion of austerity, in general, is not necessarily always motivated by racism, per se. For example, in other more racially homogenous countries, it can often be motivated by classism or casteism, or just simply being misguided or guided by, money. But it does inevitably maintain social and economic hierarchies and exacerbate pre-existing inequalities in a society. It is typically implemented as a way to maintain and perpetuate those inequalities, including racial inequalities. And so, for a little bit of historical context for you, in case you weren't aware, America has had a pretty bad racism problem for some time now. For starters, we enslaved an entire race of people for nearly 250 years. It's kind of our origin story. That, and of course, Native American genocide. White supremacy in general. And nothing about America or its political history is going to make much sense if you don't start off with this fact. And in that spirit, it is important to understand that political arguments for austerity in America have always been marketed through racist appeals to white voters. A sinister sales pitch that implicitly promises white people a leg up in the social, economic, and political hierarchy. And no, I'm not talking about this guy who has infected our politics for the last 40 years. Not yet, we will get back to that guy. In the meantime, join me as we pinball our way through the ages, because the political bond between fiscal conservatism and white supremacy goes back much further in our history. It is time for Racism and Capitalism, a love story. In her essay, The Austerity Politics of White Supremacy, Vanessa Williamson describes how this dynamic came to prominence during the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. She writes, when the former Confederate elite mobilized to successfully overthrow the multiracial Reconstruction era governments in the South 150 years ago, it was under the banner of fiscal conservatism. You see, during Reconstruction, political alliances between the formerly enslaved freedmen and poor whites with shared economic interests began to form, resulting in the elections of government officials that proposed using tax dollars to invest in social goods such as infrastructure, public education, and support for the sick and the poor, what the Constitution might describe as general welfare, and we couldn't pass that. This did not sit well with the ruling class of landowners who didn't like seeing their taxes increase, or the people who they once literally owned, now in the seats of government power as elected representatives. Yet, because the former Confederate states were still occupied by federal troops who protected the voting rights of the newly emancipated black citizens and the politicians they elected, the wealthy elite found themselves in a conundrum. But efforts to maintain white supremacy in America have always managed to be incredibly resilient and innovative. These white supremacists developed a strategy of breaking apart this multiracial coalition by creating the political identity of the taxpayer. Williamson writes, they focused their critique of Reconstruction on rising government debt and excessive spending, painting government by black people and poor whites as intrinsically corrupt. Adopting a new identity as concerned taxpayers helped the rich bridge the divide with small white farmers for whom new land taxes were heavy, while avoiding explicit opposition to black male suffrage, which might smack of treason to Northerners. And even though, by night, they partnered with violent organizations like the KKK that intimidated and murdered black voters and politicians, by day, this group of concerned taxpayers used colorblind rhetoric to divide the burgeoning multiracial coalition in order to benefit the ruling class. Is some of this starting to sound familiar? Because to me, it sounds a bit like Paul Ryan's depiction of takers and takers, or Newt Gingrich calling the first black commander-in-chief the food stamp president, or when Mitt Romney said this.
47% of people who vote the 47% will put them in bar. When I find out that they're victims, believe the government has a responsibility to care for them, believe they're entitled, they own their food, their housing, investments in time, and government should do it. And they will vote for this president no matter what.
And this motherfucker is probably the best Republican in the Senate today. How fucking sad is that? But news box, you shriek. None of these people even mention race at all. They're just concerned about our out-of-control spending. The fact is that through code words and dog whistles, the very notion of the social safety net has been racialized for decades. Watch as former leading contender for the Republican nomination for president, Rick Santorum, inadvertently let the cat out of the bag.
Just keeps expanding. I was in Indianola a few months ago and I was talking to some works in the Department of Public Welfare here, and she told me that the state of Iowa is going to get fined if they don't sign up more people onto the Medicaid program. They're just pushing harder and harder to get more and more of you dependent upon them so they can get your vote. That's what the bottom line is. I don't want to make black people's lives better by giving them somebody else's money. I want to give them the opportunity to go out and earn the money.
During this era of colorblindness, António knew that he messed up. He said the quiet word loud. So he quickly scrambled into damage control. The other thing is, I looked at that quote, I looked at the video, and I'm pretty confident I didn't say black, but I think I started to say a word and sort of grew and sort of mumbled it and changed my thought. You see, he wasn't talking about black people, he was talking about blah people. True story. When I was in second grade, a classmate called another classmate fat. The teacher scolded him for being rude, but then he didn't say fat, he said fat. And the teacher asked, what does that mean? What does that mean, fat? He never did find out, but that's just a random story about children that I brought up for no reason. Anyway, the truth is, these guys are all just cheap knockoffs of the kind of rhetorical dog whistles and racialized cougars, pitifully attempting to recapture the limited magic exemplified by the patron saint of the racist grid that is austerity politics in America.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Remember, we can't solve unemployment without solving basic culture. Out of control government spending, the skyrocketing inflation and interest rates that led to unemployment. It's now common knowledge that our welfare system has itself become a puppet. Creator and reinforcer of dependency.
A quick piece of personal advice. I would strongly suggest not spend hours listening to unedited conversations, especially if you suffer from there is a fairly good chance you have a kid. It's what I've been told by Texas writer who died from it.
But remember, we can't solve unemployment without solving the things that cause it. The out-of-control government spending, the skyrocketing inflation and interest rates that led to unemployment in the first place. It's now common knowledge that our welfare system has itself become a poverty trap. Creator and reinforcer of dependency.
A quick piece of personal advice. I would strongly suggest that you not spend hours listening to unedited Ronald Reagan speeches for the purposes of research, especially if you suffer from anxiety, because there is a fairly good chance that you have a panic attack. Is what I've been told by this episode's writer who died from it. Now you'll notice that this silky smooth rhetoric is completely colorblind. He even sounds like he legitimately cares and is earnestly trying to protect the citizens of the country from the dangers of out-of-control spending. This public perception gave Reagan the license to decimate the social safety net, fueling an enormous increase in income and wealth inequality while dramatically exacerbating the racial wealth gap. Which is why the content of the recently released audio of this call with Richard Nixon regarding African delegates to the United Nations should not have come as a surprise to anyone. The fact is that Reagan's racism was always on full display for anyone willing to recognize it. But I'm sure it's just a coincidence that he kicked off his presidential campaign with a speech about states' rights in Mississippi near the site of the infamous murders of 3 civil rights workers during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This was the perfect dog whistle, finely tuned to the frequency of his intended audience, with just the right amount of plausible deniability. Reagan was the king of the racist dog whistle, like his myth of the Chicago welfare queen, who he claimed had 80 names, 30 addresses, and 12 social security cards, collecting veterans' benefits on 4 non-existing deceased husbands. She's got Medicaid, eating food stamps, and she's collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free cash income is over $150,000. Of course, this claim was total bullshit, but it helped him win the case for austerity and 2 terms in the White House, carrying 49 states in the 1984 presidential election. 49! states. 1984, folks! This psychic trauma is why the Democrats from this era are the way that they are. Because for many white voters, if reducing the debt meant preventing the use of their hard-earned tax dollars on T-bone steaks for all those strapping young blah people, then they were all in. Even as these cuts to the social safety net also hurt a whole lot of white people. The sick irony is that the national debt nearly tripled under Reagan's presidency through tax cuts for the wealthy and a massive increase in military spending. I just had deja vu. There must be like a glitch in the matrix. So what the hell is really going on here? But before we answer that question, and speaking of capitalist puppet masters, an ad with a puppet that everyone loves.
Hello, best friends. Did you listen to Wombo's speak? Of course you do, Santa Claus. You love Wombo's voluptuous speaking voice. And, well, then, if you listen to Wombo's voluptuous speaking voice, you can listen to Wombo's speak using Raycon earbuds. They're buds for your ears. From a company co-founded by Ray J and beloved by such celebrities as religious athletes and Mike Tyson and religious athletes and Wombo and the Cody.
Yeah! Oh, God! Where am I? What is this place? Ah!
I have summoned Mr. Cody to show you just how nice and crisp, powerful earbuds look on his flashy mortal head. Isn't he so dapper and loyal? No pesky wires to get in the way of his handsome face. And with 6 hours of playtime, Wombo can make it a Cody listen to Wombo's sultry voice for a very long time for half the price of other premium audio brands. Mr. Cody uses it every day to talk with his best friend Wombo or listen to podcasts on your own. While you're listening to Wombo speak to Mr. Cody, or maybe you're listening to Wombo speak? These earbuds look great and feel even better. Bring your favorite Wombo on the go. Not to mention Raycon's fantastic customer service and 45-day clearance time policy. Nobody knows fantastic customer service. Plus, they come with a snappy and compact charging case. Click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/somenews to get 50% off your Raycon passes. Doesn't it sound just swell? Bluetooth connection is painless and easy. Just recover the Wi-Fi and tornado colors so you can buy one or two or three or four or five or six or eight or six for your daily workout or work or going out to work or going out. Or because of the customizable health tips included, you can get a comfortable earfit for everyone. Even Wombo's limited health ears. So go to the link below and buy one or two or four or three or seven and get your special discount or Wombo will get angry and you don't want Wombo to get angry. Do you? Earbuds.
Thanks, best friend. To better understand what's happening in American politics today, I think it's worth examining another era in American history. In between the austerity politics that took hold as backlash from Reconstruction and the Reagan Era. In the 1930s, a series of economic calamities such as the stock market crash in 1929 and the man-made ecological and economic disaster of the Dust Bowl coalesced to create the Great Depression. In response to the devastating misery and nearly 25% level of unemployment, President Franklin Roosevelt ushered in a domestic political program known as the New Deal, a dramatic expansion of the federal government's role in providing economic relief to citizens. In essence, the social safety net was created, industries were reformed, and more power was given to workers through an expansion in union rights. And then, following the enormous sacrifices Americans made during World War II and the subsequent economic boom and the geopolitical dominance that America experienced in the aftermath of the war, a political consensus was reached that the federal government could and should play a central role in improving the lives of its citizens, the promotion of general welfare. A massive government endeavor was undertaken that essentially created the American middle class, which included huge investments in housing, education, employment, and the nation's infrastructure. Billions of dollars were spent on electrification and the interstate highway system throughout America, The GI Bill, one of the largest and most significant pieces of legislation in American history, provides the education and employment of millions of people. The Veterans Administration guaranteed the loans for millions of home buyers, which skyrocketed the construction of houses and led to the growth of civil areas. In his book, When Affirmative Action Was White, Ira Katznelson writes, by 1948, 15% of the federal budget was devoted to the GI Bill, and the Veterans Administration, VA, employed 17% of the federal workforce. The basic tenets of this philosophy operated as the default political paradigm for decades. And while this era in American life may seem like an outlier, there was an important component during this period that was notably consistent. That's you see, in response to the Reconstruction, the innovation and ingenuity of white supremacy overwhelmed the political party, and the Jim Crow segregation era. As a result, there were explicit mechanisms to cut black people out of the benefits of the nuclear program and post-war middle-class expansion policies. The disproportionate power of the South to oversee the shaping of federal policies is how transformative legislation such as the Social Security Act was able to pass with 77%. Because the Southern lawmakers were able to exclude its benefits to people in minority-valued professions, such as agricultural workers and domestic servants, jobs that were also excluded from the newly created unemployment insurance program. Because as everyone knows, farm workers and maids don't need a social safety net after they retire. And of course, black people were also denied the opportunity to join unions and receive home loans because of redlining and restrictive covenants, and were made to absorb the negative impact of infrastructure projects and electrification due to the rapid highways and toxic energy facilities were built in their neighborhoods. To this day, black people continue to disproportionately suffer from the health consequences of air pollution caused by the implementation of these policies, regardless of their economic class. In reference to the drafting of the GI Bill, Ira Katznelson writes, written under Southern auspices, the law was deliberately designed to accommodate Jim Crow. Its administration widened the country's racial gap. The implementation and enforcement of legislation in the Jim Crow era was intentionally put into the hands of local and state governments, which allowed them to cut black people out of the benefits of these laws. Katznelson writes, a survey of 13 Mississippi cities by Ebony Magazine found that of the 3,229 VA guaranteed home, business, and farm loans made in 1947, precisely 2 had gone to blacks. And one of the main mechanisms that the South utilized to exert such influence over these policies, even though they comprised the minority of the legislative body, was the Senate filibuster. But wait a second, I thought that
it has no racial history at all. So there's no dispute about the story.
The Turtles' dad from Robin Hood is right about one thing. There is no dispute among historians about the racial history of the filibuster, because the filibuster does in fact have an incredibly racist history. While it seems to have been inadvertently unleashed by that guy who shot Lin-Manuel Miranda, the obscure senator that defined the mechanism and debate on the bill became exploited by one of the great racist villains in American history, John C. Calhoun, who used this loophole to protect the interests of slaveholders. Over time, this totally random, unintentional rule that's not in the Constitution and can be overturned at any time by a simple majority vote grew in its ability to, in essence, give veto power over many forms of legislation to a minority of senators. For decades, this tool was primarily used for the purpose of blocking civil rights and anti-lynching laws, and even just eluding the threat of the filibuster was taken advantage of by the Dixiecrats, who had developed seniority power through the proto-fascist one-party rule in the South to shape legislation in order to maintain this other way of life, which was, of course, not so subtle code for white supremacy. During the Jim Crow era, when white supremacy was an explicit aspect of American life codified into law, and the benefits of massive government spending efforts could be easily denied to black people, the opposition for large government spending programs failed to coalesce. The white majority population was perfectly happy for the government to spend vast amounts of money to make their lives better, as long as it came along with the assurance that black people were mostly left out to do it. By contrast, in the brief periods of our history where the rights and enfranchisement of black people in this country were actually enforced subjectively, white supremacists masked their appeals to the colorblind packaging of austerity policies, which benefited the ruling class. Appeals for austerity were never popular because voters never really cared about the budget or deficit or government spending. This was always just the wrapping paper covering the real package. The promised benefits benefits of white supremacy is the equivalent of your daughter arriving in this sweet package. When the rights of freedom were protected by the government during Reconstruction, they resorted to austerity policies. And then, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended this legal segregation, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the right of black people to vote, it's not a coincidence that they resorted to austerity politics yet again. Which gives us some insight into our current moment, because it is also no coincidence that Donald Trump was the first president elected after the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. And even though Trump absurdly promised to entirely eliminate the national debt, he also proudly proclaimed,
I'm a king of debt. I'm grateful. Nobody wants to get that in. I made a fortune by using debt. And things don't work out. I negotiated debt. That's a smart thing, not a stupid thing.
and sure enough, he grew the national debt by $7.8 trillion in 4 years. During his presidency, Trump almost entirely discarded the discreet packaging austerity measures and instead focused on the real self-improvement of the base, white debt. Trump was the monster the conservative did. For such a monumental liar, Trump further exposed the brutal truth. It was never about the debt or the level of government spending. It was always about who's in charge and who should be in charge culturally, economically, and politically. We know full well what the answer to that question has been throughout American history. Which is why today's complete abandonment of austerity politics in favor of cancel culture hysteria is not really that surprising. This moral panic is a frenzied attempt to reassert cultural dominance. Because at its core, cancel culture is about who's in charge. Most of these controversies are really about white people being bad. They aren't allowed to be homophobic, misogynistic, transphobic, anemic, or racist anymore. And this has become even more clear as the right has started to shift focus from their concerns over how cancel culture supposedly limits the free exchange of ideas in favor of literally trying to cancel a school of thought known as critical race theory, even though they have no idea what it actually is.
This leading was the unconventional kids had wanting to kill their father and marry their mother.
Now, as I mentioned, the ability show he will have a lot more to say about this latest boogeyman concocted by the right. But for the purposes of this video, the main thing you need to know is that the aim of this latest endeavor by the GOP to create a moral panic of the idea of critical race theory accomplishes the exact same goal as the cancel culture frenzy that they've been promoting. To incite the fear in their base of support that white people's cultural, political, and economic status in society is under threat by black people and woke ideology and communism. But it's actually the same old story. Only now, they have the license to be more explicit about it, in a way that they haven't been able to since the point of the lifetime. And while all of this comes across as ridiculous and embarrassing, because it is,
Obrigadinha.
that an ideology